periodically have to stop and click the admit button as people hang out get into the waiting room. But we're scheduled for 10, so we will get started. Before I share the screen or anything, we're going to be doing Torah study for Rosh Hashanah, and there are two Torah portions that are key, one on the first day, one on the second day. I want to do today the Akedah, which is probably the best known of the Torah portions, because when Reform cut back to only one day, they had to figure out which one to do. So they did the Akedah. The first question is there anybody who has not ever read the Binding of Isaac, the Akedah story? Good. So it's a bit problematic, pretty much for everyone, and sometimes even more problematic because we have to read it twice a year. We have to read it at Rosh Hashanah, and then after Simchat Torah, when we get to it in the Parashah cycle, we have to read it all over again. So therefore, we have to deal with the issue twice a year. The question that I have, just very quickly, if anybody would like to share, what is when you think of the Akedah, just very one or two words, what's your initial feeling about the Akedah? So you can unmute and share something if you have something to share.
Yuck.
Primitive.
Yeah, it for most of us, I think it's a disturbing story, and I think we spend a lot of time talking about it and trying to make it less yuck and figure out an interpretation so that it's not quite so yuck. I've heard a number of them, and some of them appeal to me more than others.
And that, of course, is the challenge that the rabbis face, because they have to deal with it somehow and do something with it and try to make it less offensive in some ways. Other quick responses? Yeah.
Well, isn't that similar to many parshiot where you can interpret it and make it less yuck?
Yeah, I think one of the things that the rabbis like to exalt of the Torah is that we don't whitewash our ancestors. We don't, try to make them more than human. Sometimes we make them very human in their weaknesses as well, and use the Torah sort of as the challenge to learn from the negative example of those who went before. Is also part of family dynamics, that we learn from the negative example of our parents, not just the positive example sometimes, or the negative example of our teachers, learning to be teachers not like those that taught us. So, to be like Abraham. Just any other quick thoughts about the Akedah? Yes.
Well, I also find it challenging, but I also try to reserve it in things that, like you said, there are both sides to it, and that it's there for a reason to help us understand something that maybe isn't always obvious.
And not only that, but of all the Torah portions that the rabbis could have chosen for Rosh Hashanah, then the challenge, of course, is what did they have in mind when they put it in there? In fact, one of the reform changes not only was to go from 2 days back to 1 day, but in some reform, they took the Torah portion of the first chapter of Genesis rather than the Akedah, since this is the beginning of the creation of the world renewal. Reform said, why not? Let's read the story of the renewal, the creation of the world. And so that was put in, and that was certainly a lot less yuck in that way, but perhaps also not as deep as might be done. I've done a number, obviously, over my years of sermons on the Akedah, including where is Sarah's voice in all of this at the beginning of it. We don't hear much of Isaac's voice. The basic question, it starts with the statement, God tested Abraham. And one of the questions that I raised in one sermon, actually several sermons, one of the nice things about being an interim rabbi was I got to recycle sermons and nobody knew it, as I worked with different congregations every year. But one of the ones I posed was, did Abraham pass or fail the test? Because it's not actually stated in the text whether this was a passing or a failing grade that Abraham got. But if you were disturbed by the Akedah that you've read over all these years, I have a way of looking at it today to this year that will probably disturb you even more.
Great.
And to do that, let's take a look at it. So one of the first things you'll notice is that there are a few verses missing from the text as I'm going to be presenting it to you. And the reason for that is the tradition, of course, has to read the text in its entirety. The modern liberal and the form critical takes the text, the Torah text, apart and says, these were told by these people from this area, and these were told by these people from this area, and only later did some editor, redactor, possibly in the time of Ezra, possibly Ezra, post-Babylonian, did they take these two disparate texts, which actually had different stories telling us different things about our ancestors, and put it together and made it sound like it was one story about a series of ancestors. I have a Sunday morning Hebrew class that I've been doing now for 18 months with those who graduated my Learn to Read Hebrew some 20 months ago at TBZ. And in order to keep their reading practice going and in order to deepen the studies of learning to read Hebrew, we've been looking at the Torah from what does it really say, looking at it with a deeper understanding of the language, the grammar, the philosophy behind it. And we've been approaching it from the form critical. So we've been looking at the E story and the J story and the P story. We haven't gotten to the D because in the 18 months, we are finally on chapter 22 next Sunday. And so my group, my Sunday morning class, is going to be doing in much more depth. We're going to be doing 19 verses in 45 minutes. They're going to be doing 19 verses in about 4 weeks. So that's the depth that we look at it. But the text, just a quick overview, because we're going to only look obviously at certain parts of it. This is what most modern scholars say was the E version of the Akedah. There is no actual, I call it the Y version. The form critical calls it the J version because the German J and the Hebrew Y got confused with each other. So it's the Yud He Vav He, not the JHVH. So I call it the Y version. The verses that were missing were actually the editor redactor's edition. And one of the things that we find when we're reading this is that if you read the text without any presuppositions, without any prior knowledge, if you read it just the way very possibly the original E audience, the E orator, before it was even written down, but even after it was written down in their their original version, you don't feel like anything's missing. When you read the E creation story, for example, if you go from the end of chapter 1 to the beginning of chapter 5, you don't feel like there's anything missing if you didn't know it was there. And so that's a challenge you can do on your own. Try reading chapter 1 of Genesis immediately followed by chapter 5 and skip everything in between, and you'll find you didn't miss anything. And then when you read chapters 2 through 4 and without the first 3 verses of chapter 2, and you feel like, oh, okay, that's a nice story. I'm not missing anything. So here we're not missing anything except that we're missing a part that we now know. So the story begins, and I'm just going to follow along in the English. I'm not going to go through the Hebrew at this point. The Hebrew is there, and it's on the recording so that anybody who wants to go back. But God is testing Abraham, and it doesn't say why God tests Abraham or how God tests Abraham, only that God tests Abraham. And here the story has the God as Ha Elohim. At times it's simply Elohim, at times it's Ha Elohim. And one of the things that we find a problem is what does Ha Elohim mean? Is it the God or the gods or the God's name Elohim? And why the definite article? But in any case, the Elohim is testing Abraham and goes to Abraham and calls on Abraham. Verse 2 is an interesting one. Please take, kachna, please take your son, your only son, the one that you love, Isaac. The rabbis already have a problem with this because, of course, in the Torah, there's no superfluous language. And if God wants Abraham to take Isaac, all God had to say is take Isaac. Why does God say, take your son, your only one that you love, Isaac? And the commentary says that this is a shortened form of a dialogue. Take your son, Abraham says, which one? I've got two. God says, your only one. He says, I've got two only ones, one only to this mother and one only to that mother. And God says, the one that you love. And Abraham says, what do you mean? What kind of parent do you think I am? I love both my sons. Okay, the moms don't like the other sons, but that's their problem. I like both of them. And God finally relents and says, okay, look, I'm talking about Isaac. Then God says, Lech Lecha, which is an interesting thing because we've already heard that before. When God said to Abraham, get up and go and leave your family and leave your home, God says, Lech Lecha. So Lech Lecha, which it can't even be translated well, is a challenge to change venue, in a sense, change relationship, change where you think you're at, and go El Eretz HaMoriah, to the land of the Moriah. And we're usually told that he went to Mount Moriah, but that's not what it says. It says simply go to the land of the Moriah. And the problem is we don't know where the Moriah is. Moriah could be related to the word Yara, from which we get Torah, or it could be related to the word Yara, which tells us that we're aiming for the target. It's an archery term. So this is the land of the archers, or the land of the learnings, or the land of the Moriites. So we're not even sure where he's going. But we do find out that it's a 3-day journey to get there. And so Abraham gets up early, he saddles his donkey, he takes 2 youths with him, he takes Isaac, his son, he takes the wood for burning, he takes everything he needs for an offering. And what is it that he's going to do? God says, Ha'alehu sham la'olah, which literally, and I translate it here literally means raise him up for a raising up. And olah is a word for a sacrifice or for an offering, but it doesn't mean sacrifice. And so maybe one of the commentaries that's often said is Abraham misunderstood God because God punned, and God said, take him up so I can say hi too, because I'm up here on the mountain. So bring him up and introduce me to him. But of course, we have the word later going to be sacrifice. The other problem here, of course, telling Abraham to bring him up is we haven't had before this any statement that God has told Abraham to make sacrifices. So this is part of a surrounding culture, a mythology that we don't really know where this comes from. And the Hebrew does say he takes two of his youths or youths. It doesn't say servants, it says youths. And we don't know who the youths are that he's taking. But he says, take him up, and Abraham travels and he gets to the place and he lifts up his eyes and he sees still far off. And he says to the youths, you stay here, and the boy and I, it says, Hana'ar, the youth and I will go up and we will bow down and we will return to you. By the way, how old is Abraham and how old is Isaac at this point? The Torah, the very next statement is going to be Sarah dies and she's 127 years old. Sarah was 90 when Isaac was born. The next statement in the Torah is Sarah's 127. That makes Isaac 37 years old at this time. That makes Abraham about 147 years old at this time. And so now we picture an old father and a 37-year-old young man. He's not a youth anymore at 37. And Abraham takes the wood, Abraham takes the fire, Abraham takes the knife, Abraham binds his son. And meanwhile, as they've been going along, they're traveling and they're moving along. And Isaac says to Abraham, Dad, and Abraham says, I'm here. Like the two of them are walking together. Where else would they be? He says, okay, I see the fire, I see the wood. Where's the offering that we're going to be giving? So if there's fire and wood, then there is some sense of offering. And Abraham says, God's going to show us the thing that we're going to be offering. And the next statement is, Vayelchu shnehem yachdav, and they went, the two of them, together. And they come to the place. Now, this was far off. Remember this, they've traveled 3 days, Isaac and the youth and the donkey and the wood and the fire and the knife for slaughtering. They've been traveling for 3 days and Isaac hasn't said a word. They get to the bottom of the mountain. They get to the place where you can still see it far off. Abraham says to the youth, stay here, we're going to go. Abraham and Isaac head off. And finally, now 3 days later, Isaac says, what's up with all this? Where are we going? What are we doing? Looks like we're going to do a sacrifice up on that mountain up yonder. What's going to happen? And Abraham says, don't worry, God's going to give us something to sacrifice. And Isaac then quietly goes off at 37 years old with his old father, and they head up. And they come to the place that the E had told them, and Abraham builds an altar, and Abraham spreads the wood over the altar, and Abraham binds Isaac, his son. Now, again, no objection, no statement, nothing going on. And Abraham now sends his hand out and takes the knife to slaughter the son. Stopping there, because verse 13 is questionable about whether it was part of the original story or actually part of the editor redactor's addition to the story. So here I just want to pause, give people a chance to share. So far, where we are in the story, Isaac has been bound up by his father. Isaac obviously has been complicit in the binding. He hasn't rejected it. He hasn't objected to it. Abraham has picked up this 37-year-old young man, stretched him out on the wood, got the fire ready to go, got the knife ready to go. Isaac is looking up. And the question is, if you don't know yet, if this is the first time you've heard the story, what's going to happen next?
Well, that's the text actually is disturbingly very unambiguous about that, because we, as you pointed out, Rabbi Sam, we don't know for a fact that this is exactly what God intended Avram to do. We don't know a good many other things about this. We don't know what Isaac is thinking. We don't know who these other youths are, and so forth and so on. But the text is extremely unambiguous as to what Avram intended and what Avram was about to do.
Right.
So his intentions are not in question here.
His intentions are not in question. God's intentions are in question.
What was wrong with Isaac?
Isaac's
Not say
awareness and
anything.
intentions are not in question.
The only thing I picked up on this time that I hadn't picked up on before is when he leaves the youths and he said, "We will return."
Yep.
That's the thing. I didn't even see that before. But he actually he's telling them that we're both coming back.
Yeah,
So
we're
Something
going
about
out.
this that he kind of still doesn't believe is true.
Well,
One of the things that strikes me, that is the first time I've ever thought of it this way, is that Isaac is not a youth. I mean, that Isaac is a middle-aged man. And so that somehow I'm trying to recalibrate the story with that in mind. It seems so strange that an adult man would be so compliant.
Yeah, that part is not really consistent with the way that story is usually presented. And also if you think of a young man, in the height of his powers in heaven, and an old man walking next to him, how exactly does this old man overpower a 37-year-old man and tie him down? I mean, how does that exactly work physically?
I would suggest actually that we've seen certainly the literary device in the Torah and elsewhere that there is a passage of time that we don't hear about. So just as we don't hear very much about Isaac's youth, what was Isaac doing when he was 10? What was Isaac doing when he was 15, and so forth? Likewise, it seems reasonable to me to assume that Isaac is some age. He's called a Na'ar, which means youth. And then in the next chapter, we can deduce that he was 37, but we don't necessarily know the duration of passage of time between these two.
And they didn't have roofies back then.
I just want to point out that Abraham and Jacob were very dynamic people, and they did a lot of things, and Isaac seems to be the person that things happened to.
yeah, Abraham and Isaac are the what we would call the interesting times. They're the headline makers, and Isaac is the nothing's happening, nothing to report time. And which would you rather live in, the big headline time or the no headline time? And given the way things are reported, wouldn't it be nice to just have a nice period of quiet where there's nothing to report in the news?
Yes.
I find myself wondering if anyone has tried to tell the story of the Akedah from the perspective of one of the unnamed youths. Hey, here we are, part of the story. And guess what? No one is going to remember our names. Yeah,
Right.
no one's going to remember your name and no one's going to remember my name. Isn't that a pity? Let's just stand here with the donkey.
Well, and not only that, but since we know of Bil'am, we could even have the donkey story. But yes, the question here is Abraham hoping that something will happen? Is Abraham misunderstanding God? Is Abraham lying to the youths because he knows what's going to happen, which seems to be, and this going back to that point about time frame, remembering that if this is the E story, then the next chapter, which is not part of this story originally, may in fact be, this story doesn't place a time. This story actually takes place sometime after Isaac is 3 years old and Ishmael did something that Sarah didn't like, either to himself or with Isaac, and Ishmael got kicked out. So Isaac could be 3, 4, 5. The rabbis even resolved this whole issue by saying, Ein mukdam ve'ein muchar, there is no early and there is no late. You can't read the Torah as if it were truly chronological. And after they said that, then they take, when they care to, they take it and read it chronological. So after saying, there's no way of knowing how old Isaac really was at this time, then the next thing they say is, oh, Isaac was 37 years old. But again, that was for their own sermonic purposes. That was not for the text. So Abraham seems to know exactly what he thinks God wants of him, and doesn't want to let Isaac or the youths know what's in it. Remembering also that if this is in fact a very later restating of a very early story that was known and was part of the Torah when it was first written, child sacrifice was part of the ancient Near Eastern culture. And is this in fact against that practice, or is this an affirmation of that practice, that Abraham was so devout that he continued what the gods seemed to want? So we don't really know yet where this is all going, and certainly don't know what's going to come of it later. We do know, if we know the whole story, we know what the editor-redactor did with it by putting them together. But for now, we just are verse 1 through verse 10, and they're heading up, and Isaac is, as a little kid or as a 37-year-old, saying, what's up with all of this? What's going to happen, Dad? And Dad just says, don't worry, it's all going to get taken care of. Is, again, Abraham still hopeful at that point? Is Abraham continuing to lie to his son? This is all going to play out at the end of the story as well. The other question, though, about this 147-year-old guy, 137-year-old guy taking a 37-year-old young man and tying him up and putting him up on the altar, up on the wood, and Isaac going along with it. And by the way, a reading of the story, again, give you a one little bit from a movie. The movie is called Venom. And in the movie Venom, there's one point where the not so good guy in the movie says to his human sacrifice, Isaac, that he's using for his experiments, he says, it wasn't Abraham who showed faith, it was Isaac. Isaac was the real hero of the story, because Isaac let himself be used as a sacrifice. So that becomes sort of a modern Marvel interpretation of the story. But yes, what is Isaac thinking? What is Isaac saying? What are the youth saying? That would be a great midrash to tell us. But right now we've got Isaac complicit with Abraham in this child sacrifice system, ready to be stretched out on the altar. Verse 10, now I'm skipping verse 13 because that's a question as to whether it was part of the original story. It was part of the editor-redactor's edition, which we'll get back to. So we have Abraham sent out his hand, took up the knife to slaughter his son, and the next thing the story tells us is God calls down and says, because for the sake that you did this thing and did not withhold your son, your only one. So it certainly sounds like Isaac's been slit. Isaac has been slaughtered. And therefore, blessing I will bless, and multiplying, and it will all be wonderful with you. And Isaac is not there, because it ends with, and returned Abraham to his youths, and they got up and they went together to Beersheba, and Abraham settled down in Beersheba.
Wow.
No return to Sarah, no Sarah at the beginning of the story, no Sarah at the end of the story, no Isaac at the end of the story. And in fact, when you read the Torah after chapter 22, Isaac is not in the Torah again. Isaac is gone from the Torah. Isaac's stories from then on are the Torah and the editor-redactor material. And in fact, later in the Torah, Jacob refers to Abraham as my father. So there's some issues about who these Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob people are. And in fact, the first extra biblical, possibly recognizable character in the Torah is Joseph. So the later Israelites really see Jacob and Joseph as their ancestors, and Abraham and Isaac become sort of mythologized pre-ancestors. But that's another story.
Wow.
So if we take the Torah, just as we've read it, we take the story, Abraham thinks God wants him to sacrifice Isaac. Abraham follows and does sacrifice Isaac. Abraham goes back to the youths, and Isaac has been sacrificed. And what happened to Isaac? The rabbis, by the way, recognized that this was, in fact, a problem. In the 8th century, we have a collection of stories around the Torah called Pirkei de Rebbe Eliezer, which was written somewhere in the late 8th or early 9th century. It's a compilation of stories that were known at that time and had been written during some unknown period, some possibly even written around that time, some accumulated from learned stories from earlier teachers. But this particular one quotes a Rabbi Yehuda, and it does not tell us what Rabbi Yehuda. You often were given, when we want to know who the rabbi was, it's told Rabbi Yehuda ben so-and-so, or Rabbi Yehuda of such and such a place, or Rabbi Yehuda the whatever his profession was. But here it's an unnamed, an unknown, an anonymous Rabbi Yehuda. And Rabbi Yehuda tells us that, and he uses the word, by the way, sword, cherev, rather than ma'achelet, which was the knife. The sword arrived on the neck of Isaac, and as soon as the sword cut his throat, his soul burst out and departed. Isaac died. And then, quoting from what will be the R insertion, which we're going to look at, there was a voice from heavens that came out from between the cherubs, between the cheruvim, which is an interesting thing because the only cheruvim we're aware of that could be between are the cheruvim that are carved on the top of the ark by Moses, which is long after Abraham. So there are some sort of cheruvim, some sort of angelic beings or divine beings, and a voice comes out between them, and it says, Al tishlach, do not send your hand. And at that point, Isaac's soul returned back into his body. Isaac stood up on his feet, and Isaac knew that the dead could now be revived. And Isaac opened up his mouth and said, Baruch atah Adonai mechayeh hametim, which is the second blessing of the Amidah. Blessed are you, Eternal One, who revives the dead. So therefore, Isaac quoted the Amidah and said, now I know what Mechayeh Metim means, what resurrection or revival of the dead. So we'll stop there again. And Isaac is killed, and Isaac is resurrected, or Isaac's soul bursts out, and God yells to Abraham, stop doing that, and Abraham then applies CPR, and his breath, his soul goes into him, and the dead is revived. This is now, remember, 8th century. So what is Rabbi Yehuda doing here? Probably a polemic against a religion that had built itself around we have the only resurrection story in history.
Look at
And
everybody's faces. We're all really disturbed.
the Rabbi Yehuda says, yes, it really happened, but you guys don't have the only resurrection. We have resurrection going back to Isaac.
So in response to
There's some
Christianity,
background noise somewhere. If everyone could mute.
I don't hear any background noise.
Go ahead, Mona. Yeah.
Two things. First of all, so one of the things you said was that Jacob was actually Abraham's direct child, and that's how the lineage continued. And
Jacob refers to Abraham as my father.
so, but that's the only, I mean, otherwise there's a blank in between, you know.
Yeah.
Something has to happen. And then the other piece is, so this was in response to Christianity, that's why they have resurrection?
Probably.
Okay, so I'm a little confused in terms of the timeline, not of the Torah, but of the commentary on the Torah here, and of the scholarship editorship, if you will. I grew up with the traditional version of the story and with the interpretation of it that this was the story that established once and for all that the Jewish people abhorred child sacrifice. And in fact, to the best of my knowledge, Rabbi Sam, there are no further stories of child sacrifice later in the Torah after this. Am I wrong about that?
Well, we actually have the story of a warrior who comes and says, if you give me a win in this battle, when I get home, I will sacrifice the first thing that I see.
Right. I forget where exactly that comes in. That's much later, as I recall.
That's in Judges.
Right. Fair enough. But in terms, if child sacrifice was something acceptable to Judaism, then my assumption is that we would have seen this from time to time throughout the Torah, throughout the Tanakh, which we do not.
So yes, that's because you have to wait till I get to the editor redactor addition to the story.
Sorry. Okay. So, this has me wondering. Well, you're going to get to that, I imagine. If we're assuming that there was a later editing that stitched two stories together, one in which Isaac did not survive, and then a later editing that says, yes, Isaac did survive, and let's write him into the story later so that he will be Jacob's father, and so forth and so on, then I find myself wondering when that editing happened. So did it happen before the Rabbi Yehuda that you were just quoting? Did it happen later?
Yeah, okay, yeah. So the Rabbi Yehuda here is creating a midrash against Christianity and is not saying that Isaac, he doesn't say that it really happened that way in the Torah. And yes, Judaism, by the time it becomes Torahitic, which is still the 7th century before the Common Era, so we're still way back in time, it becomes very much against child sacrifice. And any appearances of child sacrifice are somehow undone in the Torah. The issue, for example, of Moses being put in a basket and sent down the river, rather than his mother seeing him sacrificed. The story of Hagar sending Ishmael off under the bush, rather than seeing him die of starvation. There are elements of sacrifice. What I'm saying this story may tell us is that in its earliest roots, before it became what we know of as the religion of Israel or the view of Israel, sacrifice was still part of child sacrifice was still part of their mythology. But yes, by the time it becomes what we call Torah or Judaism, child sacrifice is thrown out, is mitigated, is against. But in its earliest root story, this story, these people who will become part of what will become the people Israel, we're not so sure that they were as vehemently against child sacrifice as we will become in the later story. So, Jeff?
Yes, I read a book by a Jewish author who talked about Abraham in both Christianity and Islam. And the Islam version, she said, believed that the test was God says something and then you do it. And my reaction to that was there have been many people who justified horrible actions and horrible ideas by saying, God told me to do it.
Yeah, and by the way, this idea that God says, and therefore you passively accept, which seems to be in this story, is rejected even in the Abrahamic story when God says, I'm going to go slaughter Sodom and Gomorrah, and Abraham objects. And one of the sermons I've done in the past is comparing this. Is in fact blind faith acceptable in Judaism and certainly even in the Torah? And that's where I raised the question, did Abraham pass or fail the test? Because does God demand blind sacrifice and then says, but I'm not really demanding it, I'm testing you to find out whether in fact you will have blind faith or whether you will have reasoned faith. And Abraham, you passed the test with Sodom and Gomorrah, you didn't pass the test with Isaac.
You'd think he would, because Isaac is his son, and the only one he has in Sodom and Gomorrah is Lot and his family. But Isaac's his son.
All right, so let's go back to verse 13, which I think may in fact have been a part of a later redaction of the E story and not necessarily the editor redactor. So Abraham sends his hand, takes up the knife to slaughter his son, and then lifts up his eyes and sees a ram caught in the thicket by its horns, and he goes and takes the ram and raises it up under, literally it raises it up as a raising up under his son, but usually that Hebrew means he offered it as a sacrifice in place of. Tachat beno, literally in under his son, can also mean in place of his son. So God doesn't tell Abraham, don't do it. Abraham he's holding his knife over his son's throat. And then Abraham decides to offer an alternative sacrifice. And Abraham chooses to offer the ram in place of his son. And then God says, you did not withhold, that is, you were willing to do it and you got lucky because you saw a replacement. And therefore I'm going to bless you. And Isaac is not killed. But I mean, can you imagine? Now let's look at the voice of Isaac. Isaac has looked up at his father standing over him, whether he's 5 years old or 37 years old, with a knife in his hand, ready to slit his throat. And Isaac is only saved by luck that Abraham says, oh, look, I can offer something else instead, that ram over there caught in the thicket by its horn. And Isaac is extremely traumatized. And Isaac says, you know, Dad, if this is going to be your relationship with God, I don't want any part of it. And Abraham goes down one side of the mountain and Isaac goes down the other side of the mountain. We can read the E story that way as well. But that doesn't yet tell us that God doesn't want child sacrifice. So now, let me pull up the part I didn't tell you, that the part that wasn't in what you just read.
So now we get the director's cut?
We get the director's cut.
Cool.
So this is the editor redactor. Give you a time frame. The editor redactor is usually credited to Ezra, which would be at the cleansing of the temple, at the time that they come out and say, oh, look, we found this document hidden away in the temple when we cleaned it out from all the bad kings that came before us. And look what it says, and they come out with the book of Deuteronomy. But at that time, or sometime shortly thereafter, we're dealing therefore somewhere in the 4th century, maybe 4th, 5th century before the Common Era, when the kingdom, that all that's left of the kingdom is the Judah kingdom. But in the 7th century, 8th century before the Common Era, when the northern kingdom is destroyed and the tribes are theoretically lost, and we get the myth of the 10 lost tribes. In actual fact, we have the powerful people and the priests and the storytellers and everybody, when they get conquered by the Assyrians, they head south and join and go to live in the Judah area. And since they're in the Judah area, they have to become part of the Judah tribe. But we have 2 alternative priestly Torahs. We have a Aaronide Judah Torah, and we have a Northern Kingdom Levitical priestly Torah, which is rooted in the E story. And that's where the modern commentaries tell us there's the J and the P. But the editor-redactor then at some point takes the J and the P and the D and whatever else and weaves them all together, making one Torah for the people of Israel for what will become Judaism. And this is the establishment of the monotheistic, God-relating, God all-powerful, God-only Judaism. And this one is a God does not want child sacrifice. And there are indications that a lot of these other surrounding practices were still being done by Israel in those early kingdom days, because we keep hearing about kings who worship Baal and kings who went into the Ashtaroth and kings who raised up all of those other things. So now Judaism is going to tell us God doesn't want sacrifice. And God calls, and it's always, when it's the Y story, when it's the Yud Hey Vav Hey, in the E story, the Elohim, God talks directly to people. In the Y story, Yud Hey Vav Hey talks to people through intermediaries, through malachim, through angels, through messengers. So an angel of Y calls down from the heavens and says, Avraham, Avraham. This, by the way, is one whole High Holy Day sermon on the 4 times in the Tanakh that people are called by their name twice. And Avraham, Avraham is going to be the first one, Yaakov, Yaakov, Moshe, Moshe, and then Shmuel, Shmuel. And it's a time of major transition of views. So this, for the editor-redactor, becomes the child sacrifice is not acceptable. Do not send your hand to the youth. Do not do to him anything, because now I knew, because you are trembling before E, you are in fear of, you are in awe of, and you did not withhold your son. So this is the second statement. We already saw the angels that Elohim, that God said, you did not withhold your son. And now we're told that Abraham sent his hand out. And now we're told, don't send your hand out. And then Abraham sees the ram, which may or may not have been needed by the editor. The editor could simply have said, and Abraham called the place God will see. It's still called the mountain of God being seen, which means it's not the mountain of Moriah, but it's the mountain of God's revelation. And an angel calls out again to Abraham a second time and says, in my name I have sworn, says God. So you are now, the editor takes this and sticks it into the middle of the story that we saw, and we have the story that we now know, which is still as problematic for us as it was before. And that is, what is this Abraham blind faith business? But it's now, in a sense, did the earliest Jewish or proto-Jewish peoples, these early Israelite people, still think that child sacrifice is acceptable? And it's only Judaism as it develops. So yes, this is long before the 8th century of the Common Era, the Rabbi Yehuda and the Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer. This is the early development of Judaism as a fundamental state religion, child sacrifice is not accepted. But
What year was that, Rabbi, you'd say?
so probably 4th or 5th century before the Common Era. This is Second Temple time.
Okay, thank you.
So you're talking now roughly, you suggested earlier this might have been at the time of Ezra.
Right.
It sounds to me not as though this was, if we arbitrarily say that this is Ezra making this revelation, it sounds to me not as though Ezra was saying, look, I'm telling you people that God does not want child sacrifice, and here you are. It sounds to me more as though there had been a stream of thought against child sacrifice, and Ezra was basically nailing it in place.
And that's very, very likely that there was a stream that said child sacrifice is part of the surrounding cultures, and we do it when we take on their traditions, which some of our kings did. But we're constantly getting in the book of Kings, God keeps saying, I don't like this king. You're not doing what you're supposed to do. So there certainly would seem to be, Ezra doesn't necessarily make up much, but Ezra canonizes different strains into the acceptable strain, that there are varieties of Judaism back in the First Temple and Second Temple times, back in the unification of the peoples who were under Joshua and Judges. They were a disparate group of tribes, perhaps coming together as a confederation at times, but eventually become a nation. That even in the tribal times, there were some strains of what was going to become Judaism. There were some strains that said, we do this, other strains said we do that. Which, by the way, the modern view, yeah, somebody's. So the modern view that, you know, we have Reformed, Conservative, Orthodox, Reconstructionist, Renewal, blah, blah, and never before until the Enlightenment were there different branches of Judaism. So never before were there different branches of Judaism. In actual fact, if you look at Jewish history, every time, throughout every stage of Jewish life from the beginning, there were different strains of Judaism. And even back then, and what Ezra is doing is not necessarily making it up, but saying this strain, this anti-child sacrifice strain, this combined strain, and I'm going to interweave the stories to reinforce, and even this monotheistic strain, because we still have in Torah, you know, we have recognition of other gods. You know, we read Micha Mocha as if it's, you know, there is only one God, but it's not what Micha Mocha says. In the Song of the Sea, Moses says, who is like you among all the other gods? We add that are worshipped, but Moses was saying there are lots of gods. We just have the best one, or the most powerful one. So a couple of minutes left, and that's all. So any quick comments? Yeah, go ahead.
It seems to me that if it wasn't for Ezra, there'd probably be no Judaism, because there's no continuity between Abraham and Jacob, really. It could fall apart. And that he put it together so that there is some kind of continuity and some kind of sense in this whole thing. So his role was critical in keeping Judaism alive.
So if there was no Ezra, or if there was no time frame in which Ezra worked, I mean, I don't think Ezra was a sole voice. Ezra was a representative of the time, and Judaism developed out of a time in reflection to the past, into where they were, into the future, and out of an experience of something, whether it was the Babylonian exile or something else, out of an experience that if we don't get our mutual communal act together, we will cease to exist. So certainly if there had not been the time within which Ezra worked, and if there had not been an Ezra to do that time, you know, that becomes an historical question. If there hadn't been a Lincoln, would we have had the Civil War or the freeing of the slaves? If there hadn't been this person if there hadn't been that person. But, that person simply, if there hadn't been that person, there would have been somebody else. The time was right. And so at the time of Ezra, the time was ripe to create what we now know as Torah Judaism.
Just going back to the 10 Lost Tribes, there was a book called My Father's Paradise about the Jews of Iraq who were taken by Assyria, supposedly. It's a memoir to Iraq. And as a part of the dispersal and this moving of peoples. And their miracle was that they, without being living in isolated places, they were able to survive for 2,700 years, and then eventually became part of the mainstream when they were moved to Israel.
Yeah, and actually that's a whole big talk about Jewish history and the diaspora, those who went to Babylonia and never did come back. Without Babylonia, there wouldn't have been synagogues. If we were let to stay in peace in Israel, we'd be sitting there like the Karaites, or perhaps others. So that's our time that we're given for Torah. Thank you for studying together, and hopefully now you can become more disturbed than you were before, because being disturbed is a good challenge to striving to undisturb yourself. Creativity. Ezra was disturbed by some of the surrounding strains of Judaism, and so he nailed it down into a less disturbing way. It's what rabbis try to do every High Holy Days. All right. Take good care. Be well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Terrific.
Rabbi Sam.
Thank you very much.
Terrific.
Thank you very much. Chag Sameach and Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.
Rabbi Sam, I'd like to talk to you offline at some point